Welcome, everybody. I think we can start. Welcome to this panel on where we're going to try and analyze what crisis we should be talking more about. I mean, Ukraine is a big one, and we'll be talking about Ukraine, but there might be more crises we should be paying attention to. And I'm here with Chrystel Monthéan, who is Executive Vice President for the Americas for Yara International, and David Miliband, who heads the International Rescue Committee based in New York. New York? Yes. So, I mean, let's start perhaps with, well, and first of all, if you want to tweet, I think the hashtag is hashtag WFEF23, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe let's start with Ukraine, because it's been like the mother of all crises in a way. It's been, the repercussions have been global. It's a war in Europe, but with global consequences, humanitarian consequences. I mean, Putin has been the number one person responsible for hunger, inflation, energy insecurity, on top of leading a war in Europe. So maybe David, tell us, what are the, what should we look in terms of what are you worried about, if you look at the Ukraine conflict and its repercussions in 2023?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I think there are three things that I would say to kick off the conversation. First of all, the Ukraine war represents an absolute emblem of what I call the age of impunity. The invasion of one country by another with absolutely no justification in breach of international law is a pure test case of impunity over checks and balances on the abuse of power. Secondly, I think it's very important to see that the Ukraine war is not just some kind of provincial European conflict. It has global consequences, not just geopolitics and the rule of law, but also daily life. The International Rescue Committee does an annual watch list for countries facing humanitarian crisis in the year ahead. We rank 20 countries in the world for their exposure to humanitarian crisis. The 20 countries that we highlight this year represent 90% of the people in humanitarian need around the world. And they have conflict, they have climate change, which obviously feed off each other, but the kicker this year has been food and energy price rises, and of course they're related, because as energy prices go up, so food prices go up as well. So the second global consequence, I think, is around living standards for all of us, but obviously the greatest danger is that for those who are on the precipice. I think the third thing I'd say is what am I hoping for, or what am I fearing? I'm fearing not just the continuation of the war in Ukraine, but the war in Ukraine continues to have a great sucking sound on attention, resources that are needed in other places as well, not instead of Ukraine, but as well. The Ukraine crisis, just one statistic, 7 or 8 times better funded per person than every other humanitarian crisis. So if you're a refugee from Syria or a refugee from Yemen or someone displaced internally in Ethiopia, you are not just suffering local circumstance, you're suffering from reductions in international aid when it's most needed. And I think that's the way to understand some of the consequences of the Ukraine crisis.
Chrystel, what do you think? Do you think the food insecurity, the crisis around food, is going to abate this year, or do you think it's going to worsen?
It's very difficult to plan things those days, but for me, Ukraine has intensified other crises, and then it's not so obvious the link between Ukraine and food, but in between you have nutrients. Ukraine and Russia are either very big producers of fertilizers or energy, but also of grains. And suddenly the oil flow has changed for the reasons we know. And the world is not prepared. And so I think that's a crisis that is coming up, that is less visible by people, but was dormant in a way, the food crisis. Yeah. One, because the people that need the most the food don't necessarily have access to it. It's produced where, not necessarily where people are needing it. And then we have had to reinvent the flows. Will it be better or worse in 2023? Difficult to say. I would hope that it will at least at worst stay equal than today. For the ones who don't know who Yara is, we are producing fertilizers, and a big one that is linked to yield is nitrogen. And to produce nitrogen fertilizers, as per today, we use gas as a raw material, and roughly 60–70% of the nitrogen fertilizer price is linked to gas. So when you can deduct a bit what is going on. Of course, one way for us, part of the Ukraine crisis, we realized in a way how it was obvious but was not visible. It was a dormant crisis maybe, that dependency on too few countries for raw materials in general is risky. So one way for us at least to mitigate because of this, but also because of the environmental element, nature, so is decarbonizing the system. So renewable energies, so that we manage at some point to have green fertilizers, as we say, not organic but green, not using fossil energy, to make this available, but requires investment. But that's so I think we still have some years to go, where it's difficult to predict.
There has been a grain deal, being brokered by Turkey between Ukraine and Russia. Is this deal, broadly speaking, working?
As far as I know, yes. But again, if to produce those grains, you need nutrients in the back. So unless you're sure, one thing is the trade flow of the finished product. The other thing is how you produce it. And so this needs to be tackled as well.
So which countries do you think is going to suffer most this year because of these food disruptions?
Well, I think we know that the center of the global famine crisis is well documented. It's East Africa, so Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. 3 other countries or parts of countries face the threat of famine in 2023. That is northeast Nigeria, Afghanistan and Yemen. So we know that those are the most exposed. And actually in Somalia today, our teams on the ground are seeing the consequences of malnutrition. Half of all under 5 deaths are malnutrition related. That doesn't mean people starve to death, but you're more exposed to ill health, obviously, if you're malnourished. So that's the absolute apex of the problem. But we know that if you look across countries further afield, if you look to South Asia, if you look at Pakistan, for example, significant challenges there as well. Once you look into the Americas, into South America, there's mass displacement from Venezuela. There isn't the same kind of, there's a lot of poverty, but that's not the same as famine. So the documentation on this is quite clear. The UN has a 1 to 5 scale of food insecurity, and we know which countries are at level 4, and there's an argument about whether or not Somalia should already be in level 5.
Yeah, I heard about Pakistan actually and the floods,
yes.
and that the situation is very dire there.
Well, I think that 2022 was not just the year of Ukraine, it was the year when the old excuse that climate change was our grandchildren's problem was shown to be absolute nonsense. I think people sometimes forget that a rise in the average global temperature is also associated with more extreme weather events. And wherever you looked in 2022, you saw a lot of that. Pakistan, very, very exposed as a result of the floods. The foreign minister was just here, just run into him. And they're still suffering from it today because it was such a third of the country was underwater at one point. And what I see globally is globalization of risk, but localization of resilience. And that's where it's in that gap that you've got a problem. Expecting every locality on its own to build its own resilience doesn't take proper account of their capacity. And at a time when there are more and more global risks, relying on countries, whether that be Somalia or Pakistan, simply to rely on itself, it is not going to work. And the efforts to compensate for natural and man-made disasters are not yet up to the task, and if anything, the gap is growing between needs and provision.
How do you, kind of modify this kind of disproportionate? It's not disproportionate, but like you said, Ukraine is a well-funded crisis, if we can say that, compared with others. How do you make sure that the others are not, left behind? And we're talking about Afghanistan not so long ago. a lot of the attention was focused on Afghanistan and the new Taliban regime.
Well, I think two things are important. One is you have to appeal to self-interest as well as moral interest. And the truth about the world's great crises is that they don't stay in the countries that they start in. So you have to appeal to self-interest. Secondly, you have to show that something can be done. I think a lot of people throw up their hands and say 340 million people in humanitarian need. Well, that's just an Everest that we can't even, maybe I shouldn't say Everest, we're in different mountain ranges, but yeah, but...
Mont Blanc.
Exactly. And that's why we've, in our watch list this year, we also said, look, the three instruments or the three interventions that you need are, one, to break the cycle of crisis, secondly, to protect civilians in conflict, because that's 80% of the driver of humanitarian need, and thirdly, manage global public goods in a far more effective way. And the climate is a classic example, but so is the health pandemic, which we shouldn't forget. Now, that's easier said than done, but I think in each of those buckets, I think you've got to be able to offer that alongside the self-interest is something that can make a difference.
Chrystel, you are overseeing the Americas.
Yep.
You know, which country for you is the most vulnerable? I mean, you were talking about Venezuela in terms of migration. This is one. This is also one.
I think
of
I was listening to you, and a lot of the examples you were giving. Of course, there's the ones that are more political, linked to politics and so on, as we know. But there's the one that is maybe less visible, even though you mentioned examples, is the ones related to nature and climate change and all what is linked to this, and ultimately. So if I look on the Americas, where I'm based in Colombia, so you have those two types happening. So you have, yes, I've seen myself a kind of an exodus of Venezuelan people on the road, traveling, walking to come to Colombia and to come to Bogota in the streets.
You live in Bogota?
Yes, and creating a lot of insecurity. So the security in Colombia is decreasing, not because of the Venezuelan people, but back to poverty. You know, they don't have money to feed their family. They are usually very young families with a lot of kids. So it's a different, and why this? Because of politics in Venezuela. So they think it will be better in Colombia. Funny things 20 years ago was the other way around. The Colombians were going to Venezuela. So the world, but that's political risk in a way. When it comes to climate, so temperature changing, soils, again, that's our field, but this is all linked to food production. I think a lot of people forget where the food is coming from. And it's coming from, as they say, the indigenous people, they say Mother Nature. So we have gone too far away from Mother Nature and how dependent we are as the humans on this. And I think it's visible. I mean, I'm French, so I see this summer there was a lot of fire, those floods. I mean, so it became a bit more visible. But for me, it's I don't know how long-term crisis it is, but it's a less acute, less attracting medias maybe. But ultimately, it's a fundamental crisis we have to touch upon. Otherwise, our clothes, our plates, all what we have here, basically, is coming from nature. So, and the fact that agriculture in general has not been fully recognized for its role, both to feed us, but also to protect the environment, if it's done right. And that's a problem. A lot of farmers, in the field, are not so knowledgeable. And in a way, who can be? Because today, to be a farmer, you need to be a physician, a chemist, a finance, an IT, so it's a very complex job. So for me, that's something, it's really, I think it's mapped as one of the global risks, right, by WEF, failure to tackle the climate, or I would say the nature as a whole, because we are talking climate, tomorrow will be water, biodiversity, I don't know which sequence, but that's what we see. Take my region to answer your question, the Americas. If I look, of course it's Canada, but if I look Mexico down to Brazil, for example, coffee production. You know, the weather change means that I don't have the figures in mind, I don't remember right now, but the big part of the land that is today suitable for coffee production will not be by 2050. So what will be the income of those families? Where the coffee companies will go to source the coffee? In Ethiopia, maybe it's not better in Ethiopia. what may happen, take a country like Colombia, the farmers will climb the hill because then temperature is cooler, but then it means deforestation. Deforestation is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas in agriculture. So that's what I mean, you know, it's less visible, but probably, I don't know if more or less risky, but it's a big risk that we have over our head, because climate means food and everything else.
And in terms of migration risk linked to climate change, have you, I mean, do you feel like it's going to be like a big thing this year? Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. We already know that people are moving as a result of the climate crisis, but they're generally moving inside their own countries. So they're internally displaced. They're not yet crossing borders. They cross borders when there's conflict. Now, conflict can be stimulated by clash over resources. The clash over resources can be stimulated by or exacerbated by the climate crisis. So I'm slightly reluctant to talk about climate refugees. We have climate IDPs, internally displaced people, at the moment. But to the extent that migration means movement of people as a result of changing nature, nature is man-made today, it's happening today. It's mainly within countries, though.
Do you expect more migration from Ukraine this year, or you think that the big wave of exodus has been...
Well, the Ukraine crisis is unusual for the amount of funding to support refugees. But it's not unusual in that the vast bulk of refugees from Ukraine have stayed close to Ukraine. Now, one obvious explanation is that the refugees are all women and kids, really, or very old men.
Yeah.
Sort of 18 to 60-year-old men are obviously in the army, so it's an unusual refugee population, but they are close by. And our experience is that there's a lot of movement backwards and forwards. A lot of people left in March to May. Many came back over the summer. As the bombing campaigns have restarted, they've returned. So there's quite a lot of movement. And I think that's going to remain the case as we have this kind of asymmetric war, a very early 20th century war in the east of Ukraine, and then drone-based missile strikes across the country.
You don't want to talk about climate crisis, but could we say food crisis? Because ultimately, could it be that Ukrainian people are ultimately willing to stay also because Ukrainian is a strong powerhouse for grain production and food?
Yes,
whereas
I mean, I don't know what
other countries in Africa, if you combine both the political situation and the food situation, is it the combination that makes them the food rather than climate? But behind food, there's a bit of climate.
In the Ukraine case, it's pretty clear why they're leaving. They're leaving because they think they're going to be a missile strike on the house that they're living in. So it's not I don't think one can say that people are leaving Ukraine because of food or climate issues. But obviously, Ukraine is important to the global food system. I'm very happy to talk about climate where appropriate. So Ethiopia is conflict and climate.
Exactly. So those are the two things.
Yeah.
That was my point.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's I mean, how do you handle the Ukraine crisis? Do you feel you need to do much? Because basically, you know, there's so much private donations and private initiatives and governments.
Yeah, we have teams. There's a big UN operation inside the country, but hard to reach communities. We were in Kharkiv 36 hours after the military said it was safe to go there. So fast response, hard to reach communities, especially disadvantaged communities, specialist help for kids who've lost their parents. So that there's an important role for non-governmental organizations, but it's important to say that inside Ukraine, the government is functioning.
Yeah.
So the health system, the education system functions, and we work very closely with them. Obviously in Europe, there's specialist need in schools and in the labor market to help refugees, so we support that there. But it's a very important part of the message of IRC, International Rescue Committee, that there are global crises, not just a Ukraine crisis.
Yeah. And talking about a country where it's more difficult to operate as an NGO, Afghanistan, what's been your approach since the Taliban have said, they basically banned women from all public places, and a lot of NGOs have been, wondering whether they could still operate. There's been a lot of debate. But
it's a very difficult situation. I mean, we've actually expanded our operations in the last 16 or 17 months since August 2021, since the Taliban took over. And we now have 8,000 staff there, including 3,000 women. But there's a new decree relating to the employment of women by NGOs, and that's what we're working very hard to try and gain better understanding and find a way around this, because you can't run a humanitarian operation without women staff, not least because 20%, more than 20% of the country are female-headed households, and according to local edict, only women can serve women. So in a female-headed household, you need humanitarian aid work, because it's a very sensitive issue at the moment. We're actually on Sunday, the day before yesterday, we reopened our health facilities in 4 provinces because of understandings with the government about the way in which we would be working, and it's a very important week for the future of humanitarian work in Afghanistan, where 97% of the population are living in poverty.
Yeah, and especially women are most at risk, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to know if there are any questions in the room, specific questions for our panelists, yeah? And can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Irene Hell. I report for Copenhagen Post and various sources. So it's super important that you're here. Your organization was founded by Albert Einstein, and he said a famous quote about stupidity of the humans. So you're definitely not stupid, you're very smart. You said if we focus on the self-interest of people, we have a chance. So how do you manage to get the support, this massive support you generate for crisis all over the world? Thank you.
Well, I hope what I said was that we have to appeal to self-interest as well as moral interest. And if it's only the moral interest, but people think that or governments think, or companies think, that their intervention will be useless, then it won't achieve anything. And so I think it's very important to explain that there is a self-interest and a moral interest, because this is a connected world. And well, I hope. But you've also got to be solutions-oriented, and I think NGOs have got a real responsibility not just to be in the suffering business, they've got to be in the solutions business. And one of the things that makes me most proud is that the IRC, we're 3% of the global humanitarian budget, but we're more than 30% of impact evaluations on what works, because we're about outcomes, we're about evidence, we're about innovation, because if we simply just try and do the old thing, it won't work. That is the definition of stupidity, and we don't want to fall into that trap.
Yes?
Raphael Reif, MIT. A question for David. You correctly assessed and called it the age of impunity some years back, and there are more and more examples, unfortunately, proving that point. How do we stop the age of impunity, and how do you explain that for us we think there is impunity, but many countries in the world are neutral or even showing understanding for the invasion?
Yeah, so first, if you're talking about the Western world, we have to get our own house in order. You can't complain about other people's impunity if you offer examples of your own impunity. So that's quite an important lesson in an age such as ours. Secondly, I think you can't tackle impunity without transparency. It's very striking to me that the organization Bellingcat, or sorry to mention a rival newspaper, the New York Times.
I love Bellingcat.
The New York Times have done more effective work to expose war crimes in Syria or Ukraine than any number of UN tribunals, which are blocked. So secondly, you need transparency. Thirdly, there has to be credible threat to those who commit war crimes, which are the worst impunity. And it's interesting that in the German courts, there's been prosecution of Syrian generals under the universal jurisdiction statute, using evidence gathered by NGOs. So it hasn't been a governmental effort, it's been a non-governmental effort that then was picked up by the government. So those are the kind of things that are important. But I think that this framing of accountability versus impunity is a very powerful tool to understand not just political relations, but economic relations, and frankly, our relationship with the planet as well, because the way in which we're exploiting the planet is an example of impunity. The planet doesn't have votes, and the future doesn't have votes. And if I can, I'll just flag that in a month's time, the Eurasia Group and the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations will be publishing the world's first Atlas of Impunity. This will rank every country in the world on 5 dimensions of impunity: conflict, governance, human rights, economic exploitation, and environmental degradation. And I've been chairing the advisory board of this, and that's intended to provide the framing and some of the transparency that's needed. But those are the sort of things that we need MIT to help us.
Do you, I mean, IRC, are you also gathering evidence of war crimes in Ukraine at the moment? Was it part of your remit at all?
No, it's not. I mean, where we see crimes against humanity, we find ways to report them, but and so we don't stay silent when we see if there is a bombing of a hospital that we're working in, or a bombing of a block. But in different places around the world, governments are more or less tolerant of NGOs who want to report on war crimes, and so we have to find different ways of making sure that where we have evidence, it's properly used.
Right. Any other questions? Yes?
Hi, Omar Ben-Yedder from African Business Magazine. So, a couple. I mean, you alluded to it, that developed countries, and obviously I focus on Africa and I've got vested interest in terms of the African continent getting out of, developing at a faster pace. So are you saying that developed countries should be paying more attention to developing nations and their needs? And how do you go about that? Yeah, I'll just leave it to one, actually. It's fine.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that it's an open fact that over the last 15 years, China and Russia have paid more attention to significant parts of Africa than parts of the West. And that is, I think the whole world has an interest in the way in which Africa develops. We work in about 17 African countries, so I have a particular perspective on those parts of Africa that are most affected by conflict and the climate crisis and economic crisis. But as a general point, I think it's really important that we live up to the idea that we can't just make speeches about a global village and then pretend that if your neighbor's house is on fire, it's not your problem. It is. And so I think that rightfully Africans insist on African solutions for African problems, but there's got to be global responsibility in support of that effort. And when you think about the COVID pandemic, or when you think about the climate crisis, it's more obvious where help is not being given than where it is being given. And I think it's really important to try to argue against that. And when I say that countries have to get their own house in order first to tackle impunity, that's part of the explanation for why 50 countries did abstain on the UN resolution vote about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of work to do.
Is there another question? Maybe I have one. Debt sustainability. I mean, interest rates are rising. Lots of emerging markets are going to face big difficulties refinancing their debt. Is it something also on your radar?
Do you want to go? I mean, the short answer is yes. At the macro level, we're not a macroeconomics shop, so I'm not going to tell you there are 12 countries at extreme risk, 18, 24, but there's no question that we're in a new global era of higher interest rates that's going to put serious pressure on countries that have gone heavily into debt, sometimes because they're hosting refugees. I mean, remember, Jordan's debt to GDP ratio went from 50% to 100%, basically since 1 million Syrians arrived in 2011, or after 2011. Now, but there is an element of this syndrome that is very important to us. Food price inflation and energy price inflation in the 20 countries on our watch list is basically 2 to 3 times the level of that in the advanced industrialized countries. And so there's a double whammy, if you like, that affects us and that we're trying to wrestle with.
Chrystel, you want to?
I think at least in the Americas where I work, we're kind of used to the economic troubles, you know.
Turbulence.
If you take Argentina, the inflation is 100% almost. So at the end, we find ways. Argentinian finds a way to live and to operate. We find a way to do business in Argentina, despite the complexity. But it's possible. Same in Brazil. The inflation is quite heavy. In a way, it's a bit helpful to me, being Americas, to have Europe to have inflation as well, because as a company, we understand better when it's happening globally that, okay, we need to find measure, we need to keep on working and operating, but find new tools. So, yeah, adapting.
Thank you. If there is no other questions, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.